Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, the show where we interview the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today's edition is a very special celebration of the 75th anniversary of VE Day.
Hello, I'm Major General Celia Harvey, Deputy Commander of the Field Army. As such, I'm the Senior Reserve Officer in the Field Army. I commissioned into the Territorial Army, now the Army Reserve, at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in 1987. I've always been an advocate of diversity and inclusion, either formally or informally, and I'm also the Defence Sikh Champion for the Armed Forces and the Ministry of Defence. I firmly believe that talent and thinking can only be developed to the highest levels if organisations attract members from the broadest sectors of society. Remembering and commemorating Victory in Europe Day is important to me as we recall the success of Allied forces leading to the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany on the 8th of May 1945. This incredible coming together from across the world, and particularly the Commonwealth, of millions of regulars and reserves in the armed forces, but also volunteers and civilians, male and female, part-time and full-time. Millions from Britain, but also 1.5 million from India, over 600,000 from Canada. And let's not forget the Polish forces, who had a significant success at Monte Cassino, and their Air Force, who escaped to Britain and played a vital role in the Battle of Britain, as well as over 500,000 from Australia and New Zealand, thousands from the West Indies, and many others from all over the Commonwealth, including 300,000 Sikhs who helped quell the rise of fascism in the West. All were united in the effort to defeat a common enemy, and the power of this incredible unified struggle that has ensured our freedom is inspirational. What VE Day reminds us is that the very diversity of those men and women of the Allies was fundamental to securing that vital defeat of tyranny and secured the peace and freedom that is all many of us have ever known. Today we are facing a threat the likes of which very few people still alive have experienced before. We are locked in a battle with an adversary which this time is invisible, but still discriminates against particular sectors of our society. This emergency has generated the same spirit as those who came before us saw in the Second World War. People from all walks of life have come together to defeat a common enemy. The NHS, carers, scientists, thousands of volunteers and the armed forces to support the NHS and to help protect the nation in this time of crisis. The military force includes medics, specialist planners, engineers, logisticians and leadership advisors, and many of these people are from our reserves. All three services, regulars, reserves and Ministry of Defence civilians, have contributed their skills to provide thousands of beds at the Nightingale hospitals, to deliver PPE, ventilators and other critical care equipment across the nation, and significantly increase the national testing capacity. The Army Reserve is in a rare position. Our soldiers and officers can combine the skills from their civilian and military backgrounds. We're very fortunate to have experts in logistics, medical services, planning and coordination, who are sharing their knowledge and experience with the NHS and with the government to benefit us all. I am incredibly grateful to the employers and families of our reservists, who support them whether in routine training or deployments. And at this time, the Army Reserve responded incredibly quickly to this national crisis and was ready to provide talented people keen to protect our nation, just as those who went before us during the Second World War. We are living through a very different situation from the wartime of 75 years ago, but the contribution our reservists make is just as valuable in defeating this new enemy. From my training at Sandhurst back in 1987 and throughout my career, the Army has not only taught me about leadership, but expected me to put it into practice. Soldiers and officers in the reserve bring skills from their civilian jobs to the Army and take training from the Army back to their civilian work. Both gains from the other in a symbiotic relationship. Leadership in military activities is underpinned by the Army's values and standards. Respect for others, displays of courage and selfless commitment have been particularly noticeable in recent months. For instance, showing the respect we have for the frontline workers by clapping for them. Respectfully keeping our distance from others while shopping or exercising. And the courage and selfless commitment of those workers who continue to care for and provide vital services to others are displays of leading by example, and we should continue to reflect on these once this crisis has passed. I am proud to be part of an organisation that promotes diversity and inclusion and recognises the skills and talents of all our people. I have witnessed how successful we can be when we are ready to work with others regardless of their background. In fact, especially if their background is different to ours, as it is that variety of perspective, knowledge, experience and talent that finds the very best answers to difficult or wicked problems, and that can only be at its best in a diverse team.
I am very delighted to be joined by a number of very inspirational individuals from the British Army. Our three panellists today are Colonel Carl Harris, Deputy Assistant to the Chief of Staff Operations at Permanent Joint Headquarters, also the Chair of the Army BAME Network, Naveed Mohammed, the Muslim National Liaison Officer, and Lieutenant Colonel Tim Stransky, SO1 for the CE Communities and Engagement Branch. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here today. It's a pleasure to have you all. And firstly, I do hope that I've introduced you all properly, because I know in the military and in the army, titles are very, very important. And so I had a small amount of anxiety about making sure I did it right to start with. So hopefully I got that right. But for all of our listeners who are tuning in today to this very special edition of the podcast show, I wonder whether you might be able to give a brief introduction to each of you and the experiences you've had briefly when it comes to serving in our British Army, and why VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, today is so incredibly important to Britain and also to the wider society. Tim, I'm going to start with you if that's okay, because I know you the best.
Absolutely. So I've been serving in the army since 2000. I went to Sandhurst in '99, and I've done a sort of gamut of operations, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, and Northern Ireland. My current role is, as you said, I'm the Army's lead for engagement with ethnic minority communities, and addressing the most important part, really, which is Victory in Europe Day. Is VE Day is the marking of the cessation of hostilities in Europe in the Second World War, and clearly the war went on for a little bit longer with the cessation of hostilities in the Far East on the 10th of August, which is marked by VJ Day. And my own personal thoughts on VE Day is that a man called Ismail Khan, Colonel Ismail Khan, who was in the Indian Army and later the Pakistani Army, and Colonel Ismail fought with the 10th Bullets Regiment and was taken prisoner by the Japanese in Singapore in the Far East in 1941. And Ismail had a huge impact on my life, as indeed my grandfather, which led me to join the army. And what that has meant is that when I look at historical events like VE Day, I tend to look at them not just through the lens of the United Kingdom and Europe, but a wider lens of the contribution made from across the British Empire and the Commonwealth to victory in Europe, which hopefully we can talk about later on.
Thank you very much, Tim. And Naveed?
I arrived in the UK as a 13-year-old, settled in Birmingham, and the year after, a fellow student in school invited me to learn a bit more about the Army Cadet Force. And I didn't have a clue what this organisation was, but in essence, that's where my military journey started, because I started off by becoming a member of the best youth organisation that exists in the UK, i.e. the Army Cadet Force. I stayed in the Army Cadet Force until I was 18, and then I joined the Army Reserve. During my time with the Army Reserve, I deployed in operations to the Balkans, former Republic of Yugoslavia, as well as to Iraq in 2003. And then more recently, when I say more recently, roughly around about 2008, I took on a more full-time role where I've been for the last 12 years. I've worked in Army recruiting, I've worked as a career manager, worked now permanently in community engagement. But throughout the last 12 years, I've been heavily involved in the whole ED&I space. And I work at the Army's Regional Command, from where the UK civil engagement is delivered and coordinated. And essentially, that's all about making society connect with their army and building understanding of the army. What is the army all about? Is it about that breaking news, that constant footage that we've become accustomed to of Iraq and Afghanistan, or is it about 30-odd operations going on at the moment, about an organization that is agile, an organization that is fully geared up for either delivering humanitarian aid and disaster relief operations one day, or the very next day working in the UK fighting an unseen enemy such as coronavirus. And for me, what connects me and what's so important about the organization that we're in today is that we've followed on in a rich heritage of not only the British Armed Forces, but the Commonwealth Armed Forces and the contribution they made to Britain as we approach VE Day on the 8th of May. And for me, it just reinforces the fact that me as an individual and my colleagues of colour or people of different faiths who are members of the British Armed Forces are following on in the footsteps of individuals from faraway lands who made a huge amount of sacrifice for Britain, not only during the Second World War, but during the First World War, and who it is absolutely vital that we recognise today.
Absolutely agree with what both of you have said there, and so important that we remember this for what it is, and for everyone else who is involved, that we really do pay our respects to everyone who has been before us, and hopefully everyone who is to come ahead of us, and why this is so incredibly important. Carl?
I think perfect segue. Thank you, Leila. My story goes back a generation, actually. So my father was serving in the Jamaican Defence Force, and in 1965, so just a few years after Jamaica won its independence, he wanted to explore and find his dream, and his dream was to join the British Army. So he came over to the UK. He planned on joining the infantry, but obviously turned through the wrong door and ended up joining the Royal Artillery. But with no regrets for the 22 years that he served. And during that time, he met my mother, who herself, although born in Plymouth, was a descendant of Indian immigrants who left the fermenting challenges of India, sort of circa 47, 48. So my parents met in Plymouth, which is where a number of years later I was born. And so I grew up for the first 12, 13 years of my life as a service dependent, and so was exposed to that military life. Teen years were not in a service environment, but unbeknownst to me, I still hankered after the adventure that NAV has so brilliantly laid out there. And so I explored the options, and Welbeck College, the Army Sixth Form College, was an option for me to get a decent education as well as the Cadet Force, and was a stepping stone to Sandhurst, which I took. And I attended the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, 93 to 94, was commissioned then. And with no regrets. I think like many people that join the armed forces or cadets or whatever, you have that spirit of adventure, and that's what I pursued with no particular plan. It wasn't necessarily going to be the case 27 years later I find myself on a Zoom call reflecting on this with you. But here we are. No regrets whatsoever. I absolutely love the life and the opportunities that have been presented. And that's included working with some amazing people in military uniform of other nations, and indeed civilian colleagues from other government departments on operational tours in Northern Ireland, Iraq and Afghanistan, a number in each. And along the way, it's given me pause to reflect on what I have, what I've gained, what I'm fortunate to enjoy looking forward to, and how the Armed Forces Army life has provided a platform for me and my family. And looking at VE Day, and similar to Nav, reflecting on our forebears, my father and others beforehand. And for me, it has three particular elements to it. Is firstly, remembering and honouring the sacrifices of those that have gone before us, and indeed those who continue to sacrifice much today in all fields. Appreciate what we have. Sometimes we're so busy being busy, and life encourages us to be busy. It's easy to forget and appreciate what it is that we have. And third strand really is to be vigilant and protect what it is that we hold dear, and that can come in many forms. And I think this unseen enemy that is COVID-19 in many ways challenges us, but also I think has demonstrated some of the very best qualities of humanity and British society and the armed forces therein. So it's for me and with my family will be pause for reflection on Friday.
Thank you all very, very much indeed for sharing those personal stories. And I mean, it's very insightful, not only for me, but I'm sure everyone who is listening. And I completely concur with the fact that this is a time to reflect, not only because this is such an important day, ultimately the contribution of the Commonwealth as a whole to victory in Europe, including economic and material support from Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, across the world ultimately, that has come together in this very epic time. But that is in a way very reflective to the present time. And as you've all very articulately, and as I would expect in true military form, described COVID as that invisible enemy that we are all battling, no matter who we are, what background we are, whatever colour we may be or faith, is a time where we really, really must pull together and harness what is genuinely important to us, families and wider society. But I wonder, from your personal observations, obviously you've all served a number of fantastic years within the army and serving for our country. But what about this parallel we talk about in terms of the crisis today, at the time of the crisis between 1939 and 1945, and the coming together of society? What can we actually learn from that wartime experience from then and I guess also right now?
Just briefly, really using your own words actually, Layla, is to reflect on then and now. The armed forces and the army therein have always been ready to serve, whether that's on the homeland or that's overseas in all its different forms, and Nav laid out the whole variety of different forms that might take. So I think that is a central core of what the current British Army is about, and frankly has always been, and that was manifest even farther and wider across the Commonwealth and the British Empire as was. Tim?
Thanks, sir. So, I mean, Leo, I think what's really important is that 1939 to 1945, one of the key aspects of that conflict was the home front, both here in the United Kingdom and across, for our purposes, the British Commonwealth, or the Commonwealth. And this time of crisis we face now is the home front, linking to Colonel Carl's point about the nation. We've been lucky to be in a position where the armed forces have been able to support government and support the NHS coming forward in this battle against COVID-19 on the home front. And just reflecting on that, there's both regular soldiers and reserve soldiers have played their part in supporting institutions such as NHS England and wider across a whole number of different areas. So Army health workers, Army logisticians, Army planners, all have been there to play their part in support of the government.
Thank you, Tim. And I absolutely agree. And I think it's very important, and I'm sure many people know this, but just to make a very quick point, there is, it's so important that we do also pay our respects and thank everyone else who is involved as key workers, NHS, of course, but the frontline staff, but many such as the Army, the wider MOD, are far more involved than perhaps public would necessarily know, or those within businesses, because they've had a lot of time within PLC type organisations and maybe wouldn't know quite as much about the Army and the wider military. You guys had all mentioned earlier on that actually there's a lot of humanitarian aid. There's a huge amount of work that the Army and the military does behind the scenes, like you said, Tim, supporting the NHS and supporting critical organisations at times like this. And so, sorry to interrupt everyone here, but I mean, it is just, a big thanks and respect and gratitude to everyone within the forces, also who is helping our country get through this difficult time.
Well, I think for me, Layla, what connects the past and the present and potentially the future is the adaptability of the force at the time, the skills and the professionalism. I think it goes without saying that you needed to be able to think on your feet during World War II, regardless of what situation you were involved in. And that's very much the case now. You have a group of professionals who are requested by the government to come in and support their colleagues who are at the forefront of fighting this invisible enemy. If I might just take the conversation back a little bit more, engagement that I did a couple of years ago, where we sort of try to inform individuals about the expertise that has been gained in medicine by recent military operations. Because what we've got a very good system in place of at the moment is having military personnel, military doctors working in NHS hospitals. I'm talking about before the current COVID crisis, and how the expertise from the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan potentially came in and saved lives in the NHS. And I heard a doctor once say that it was amazing how the skills to treat an injured person on the battlefield were brought in, and that same expertise was able to then feed into how to treat a victim of a road crash, for example. And that, for me, that just exemplifies the mindset of the soldier on the battlefield during World War II, the mindset of a soldier in the modern day British Army who one day was involved in preparing to go out to Estonia, for example, to counter the threat we're facing as a country in that region, to all of a sudden being told, okay, now you're going to plan to command a number of soldiers to protect the nation here at home. And I think for me, it's that adaptability that really comes to the fore, and that connects the British Army of the past to the British Army of today, and going forward, the British Army of tomorrow.
Very well said indeed. And I think there's some, as you've all said there, very, very valuable lessons from the past that we can learn from in the modern world that is fighting invisible enemies. And certainly COVID is one that is affecting everyone's life right now. Tim?
Yes, so just to pick up on a couple of points that we've all brought out here is the thing I think that neatly meshes 1939, 45 and today is the whole nation coming together to face a crisis. And so, as you said, Layla, that's the National Health Service and government, key workers, be that people who empty our bins to soldiers supporting the NHS. There are a whole host of people who have stepped up to the plate to make sure that we can weather this storm. And that I think is very similar to what happened in 1939 to 1945. And it'd be interesting, if we could interview someone like Colonel Tom and ask him what his reflections were. I'm sure he could probably draw some parallels.
I absolutely agree, and what a brilliant good news story that was. I was tuning in to Captain Tom and his expeditions, but it's it's just I think it's harnessing some of those good news stories, those lessons that we can learn from once upon a time and make them relevant to right now, because it is stories and heartfelt kind of emotions and humanity that gets us through times like this ultimately. And Tim, to your point about togetherness, and in fact, Carl and Nav, you've also made these respective points. Of course, being together, being kind, and kind of looking after one another is absolutely critical now more than it ever has been, really. But on the subject of inclusion, which I think at times like this, it does really bring it to the forefront. I've heard a couple of individuals, well, within business and kind of certain organizations saying, well, D&I, is that moving to the back foot given everything that's happening right now? And I always challenge this, and I say, actually, never has there been a time to be more inclusive than right now. And actually, diversity means many different things to many different people. If you look at it in the holistic sense, D&I is not just, whilst I know you're all very passionate about BAME, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic groups, for those that don't know the terminology, very, very important, but also the holisticness of everything that falls into the inclusivity umbrella, whether it be religion and faith, Nav, that you mentioned before, whether it be, whether it be BAME, whether it be gender, whether it be LGBTQ+, whether it be some of those invisible diversities like mental health that sit below the surface, but actually are very, very key at the moment. And it'd be great to chat with you all about inclusivity, what that inclusivity means to you, and and also what we can within the wider military, and what we have seen when it comes to inclusion and embracing all, and how things now are starting to really positively change.
May I leap in? You did a fantastic job in your opening remarks of the rather lengthy job title that I have at the moment. But in simple terms, I'm a deputy responsible for the day-to-day running of UK's overseas operations within the United Kingdom's Permanent Joint Headquarters. So you have the Assistant Chief of Staff, and then I deputise for him. And about 30 overseas operations, as Nav remarked earlier. And why does that matter to me in my day job now, and indeed what we're trying to do as part of the COVID response force on the UK, which is a different entity run by the Standing Joint Commander. But irrespective, for me, and I completely echo your sentiments, that now is firstly a fantastic opportunity for D&I, ED&I to be pushed to the forefront, not before time, but more importantly to be championed so that it's sustainable, it has a lasting impact, and so on. It's not just a bumper sticker people refer to. Is the diversity of knowledge, skills, experience, perspectives that can be brought to address a whole host of different challenges and problems that are there in this interconnected and complex world. And inclusion being that entity that binds us together in solidarity and unleashes that diverse talent that you have there. Now, grouping those things together in the military context, in the armed forces, particularly now, trying to grapple with COVID and what it means for us at home or abroad. It's about culture, I think. It helps stimulate different ways of looking at problems, a willingness to learn from others that perhaps, dare I say it, 20 or so years ago when we joined, we weren't quite so inclined to do. And that's important for a number of reasons. Firstly, as an armed force, if we want to win, we need to learn, we need to adapt, we need to be willing to learn and to adapt, because the enemy, of course, that cliche, does have a vote. But increasingly, as we're doing now at home and overseas, working very, very closely with other government departments, with other organs of state and other stakeholders to try and tackle a shared enemy, right, as COVID is. And you can't do that as an army that just lives blissfully in its own little box. You can't do that as a defence force living blissfully in its own little box. We've very much got to champion the diversity that we have and champion the diversity that comes with working with others and be inclusive in that process. And I believe that passionately. Very well said
indeed, Carl. And I think, when we talk about, ultimately recognition, and I know I did mention D&I in that very kind of, the holistic terms of where we are looking at lots and lots of different facets, but, BAME in specific and ethnicity and such, I think it was relatively recently that we did not celebrate, but recognize and remember the anniversary of the death of Stephen Lawrence, which, and the reason why I bring that up is because I know you mentioned pre the podcast that was something that really did resonate with you. And I think, it is, whilst it's important to look at the holistic suite of diversity and inclusion and celebrate all those different facets and recognize those different facets, there are also certain dates and points in time, like VE Day, like Stephen Lawrence Day, that should be remembered, and we should remind ourselves why and how we ourselves could almost be in that situation if we hadn't recognised it at the time and discussed it. So I wonder, before we move on, Carl, very briefly, whether you could just share a couple of your personal experiences when that actually happened. So I know you remembered that as a vivid memory at the time.
So I was, on the 22nd of April 1993, I was a 19-year-old officer cadet at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, very much the beginning of my exciting army journey, military journey that was to follow. And at the time, speaking frankly, I recognised the tragedy of that murder, and also recognised the social challenges, if I can put it in those terms, at the time. But I was busy being a 19-year-old at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. It was through the following years where I again paused for thought a little bit more and reflected on the opportunities that I had and that I had to look forward to that were snatched from Steve and Bruce Lee on that evening. And it was in 1998 I had the privilege of being selected to command the Army's Ethnic Minorities Recruiting Team, which was an initiative as part of the Ethnic Minorities Recruiting Campaign, which was a direct consequence of Stephen Lawrence's murder, Commission for Racial Equality's views expressed about the armed forces, the Metropolitan Police and others. And I was very proud at the time to see what the British Army senior leadership were determined to do then, in turn a corner, with whether it's within the household division or more broadly. But I handed over a year later, pleased with some of the progress that had been made, but felt that there was much more work that needed to be done. Wind the clock forward another 20 or so years, and I reflect positively overall. A bit disappointed because we could have gone quicker, faster, and I think the armed forces would be very happy to say that as in willing to say that and recognise that, which is why I'm very proud to see how determined the armed forces and the Army have been in the last 5 years to really accelerate this once and for all, so that the legacy of Stephen Lawrence's murder all those years ago is there to be seen in the British Armed Forces. I think we've made great progress. We've got more progress to be made, but that is absolutely something that is central to the senior leadership of the armed forces.
Thank you very much indeed, Carl, for sharing.
If I may jump in there and just put up a case why diversity in the British Army is important today. I'm going to reel off a list of countries. We'll start off with the Caribbean islands, Ghana, Gambia, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal. A small selection of countries. Should there be a need for a British military response of whatever nature in any of those countries today, you would find people from those countries serving in the British Army today who would be able to make our response to those countries more effective. And what do I mean by effective? Understanding, cultural understanding, linguistic understanding. Give you an example, the horrendous earthquake that took place in Nepal only a few years ago. Some of the first soldiers on the ground there were from the Brigade of Gurkhas. And because these were a bunch of soldiers who had the linguistic expertise, who had the cultural expertise, they were able to begin the aid operation when they hit the ground running. And for me, that in itself just is one way of expressing how important diversity is to any organization, let alone the British Army. Very thought, different ways of thinking, different capabilities, different skills, different backgrounds, and how that can be brought in to fix a problem.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely concur. The last thing we want is to have that group think, whether it be within a boardroom or whether it be within the military context. Very difficult. And there's so many statistics out there now to prove all of this. That inclusivity and diversity breeds further innovation and aids when it comes to problem solving. So it makes absolute sense. It's not just a nice to have, as I think some people may possibly believe still, but actually it is an absolute business and organization imperative.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think so. Cognitive diversity is something that I think is really fascinating. and is something that often goes hand in hand with demographic diversity. And it, as you've neatly encapsulated, enables organisations to be better, to think quicker, to be more agile. And Carl and Nav have neatly encapsulated the immediate past and the present. And what I'd like to do, if I may, is just talk a little bit about inclusive histories, because I think that's also really important, especially when we look at VE Day. And I think there's a danger that because Victory in Europe is about Europe, that we can sometimes lose perspective on who was involved in what was indeed a global conflict. And I'm going to quote Winston Churchill here, who's not necessarily known for his inclusive and diversity credentials, but I'll explain the point here. And in a speech, he said, "Let us brace ourselves to the duties and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will say this was its finest hour." And the point there is not to aggrandize the British Empire, but to make the point that this was a thing that we did with our Commonwealth. So with Canadians, New Zealanders, Australians, South Africans, Africans from Sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria, Tanzania, Ghana, Uganda, etc., the Caribbean, Pacific Islands, and I will have missed out people who contributed. And that contribution was massive, be that the oil that was provided from Trinidad to help Operation Torch, which was the invasion by the Americans of Africa, be that the Indian divisions that fought in North Africa to help secure the Mediterranean, or the Indian divisions that fought in Italy. And in fact, we're on the subject of Italy, perhaps Monte Cassino gives us a really good snapshot of the global alliances that were formed in order to defeat fascism and Nazism. And if you consider in the 4 battles of Monte Cassino, there were British, New Zealanders, Gurkhas, Rajputs, Poles, Free French colonial forces, all of whom were involved. In fact, it was the Free French that broke in finally, and it was the Poles that then took the position. And, that just really encapsulates that. And when you look at the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain, there were Czechs, there were Poles, there were New Zealanders, there were South Africans. And we should be proud of that immense contribution from our Commonwealth, be that economic, be that moral, be that people who were actually doing the fighting. And I think it's really important to remember that. One, because our nation now reflects those nationalities in its makeup. But two, it makes moribund the sort of far-right arguments about people not contributing. Absolute nonsense. People from the Caribbean, Africa, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Jews, all people who contributed massively in the fight against fascism and Nazism. And I think we need to ensure that as we study history and we reflect on Victory in Europe Day and winning the Second World War, that we commemorate not just the British element of that, but our Commonwealth and beyond that, because I'm conscious that I've missed out the Soviet Union, I've missed out the Dutch, I've missed out I've missed out the Americans. It was a truly global effort to ensure freedom, which people who were fighting for freedom necessarily didn't have their own. And I think that demonstrates a real loyalty. And then obviously that then goes on to shape the post-World War in which we live. But, I think my key takeaway is when we reflect on the Second World War, make sure that we do it from an inclusive perspective and remember all those who contributed to victory.
Tim, that was so beautifully said, if you don't mind me saying. And as always, I could always come to you for a great history lesson because you know absolutely every detail, and I love how you explain that so fluidly there. And before we summarise what has been a whole rich host of learnings from today, I wonder, just as a final piece, whether we could just share some of the key learnings that each of us have had respectively. And if I may, a small plug here for the Army and for the reservists as well. I did actually go part way through the progress when it came to applying, because clearly the Army and the wider MOD has gone on a good journey, whilst you all have very honestly recognize that none of us, no organization is perfect. All we can do is absolutely try our best and put our line in the stand and actually start to really look at key differences. But I know as an organization, certainly for the youth of today and for all the different diverse communities that are out there in the UK, it's a brilliant career to be able to learn a whole host of different skills. And so I just wonder whether we could finish on, not only some of the biggest lessons that you guys have all learned, and maybe some of the positive pieces that have been really key to your careers, but also why this is, an excellent path for leaders of the future.
27 years in, the learning's infinite numbers. I think I'll couch it in these terms. So we set up the Army's Black Asian Minority Ethnic Network, partly as a response to all of these things, frankly, actually, as a response to all of the things that we've discussed this afternoon, and to try and help inform, inspire and empower people within the British Army to be able to give of themselves the best, reach their potential and help others to do that. Because in all of my time in uniform, and also reflecting on my father's generation and that generation's shoulders that we stand on, I've never felt that the opportunity has been so good of any man or woman of colour, not of colour, of any particular sexual orientation or faith or otherwise, or identity, to be able to be themselves, bring their authentic selves to work and then thrive. I really, really sincerely mean that. The paradox, however, was I didn't feel that we as an institution had the awareness or the understanding of all of the complexities that come with being diverse and inclusive to really unlock that talent. And so the network served to try and be a platform to bring people together, whether that's through mentoring or seminars or whatever, to try and help stimulate conversation, empower people with knowledge, give them that confidence. And why did that matter? Two things I would say to capture what I've experienced the last 27 years is people at the heart of the Army. It's a cliche, I know, but probably for a reason. And that's perhaps one of the most compelling reasons to stay in. You just enjoy being alongside a bunch of really good people. The other is empowering people with knowledge. And there was a time, and I don't think this is unique to the Army, where there could be a snobbery out there, or people could look at learned people with disdain, sort of anti-intelligentsia, if they will. I don't think that is the case now. And so I think it's recognised whether you are a private soldier, a cadet, or the most senior general, on all points between. It's about wanting to learn. It's wanting to learn from others, gain knowledge, gain skills, and really give of your best.
For me, it's really important to emphasize the journey. My experiences will back this up. The journey that the Army has come along. Unfortunately, in certain quarters, some people are just too stuck in how the Army should be potentially. I mentioned earlier on the fact that we're on this journey, and if you're not willing to be part of this journey to become a more modern, a more forward-looking, a more forward-thinking Army, then potentially somewhere else is where you need to be. I think the Army offers something which not many other organizations can offer, and social mobility of a quite a specific nature is something that comes in abundance. You could join the Army with absolutely minimal qualifications. You could join the Army with a degree in nuclear physics, for example. There will be a place for you. And there will be leaders who are increasingly taking a very active, personal, hands-on approach in how the most junior person lives their day-to-day life. What is their lived experience? And how is that junior person, he or she, regardless of their background, how is that person going to come through the ranks and become a leader themselves? Now, whether that's through a method of how we train our people, how we equip our people, how we motivate our people, the values and standards of the British Army that we instill, or is it about how can I as a leader, how can I as a general learn something of a most junior soldiers. And I think that's a very refreshing change that has come about in the most recent past. And for me, that is the mindset which will continue improving the journey that we're on and improving the British Army of tomorrow.
Just very, very brief points, which I neglected to mention about this culture of learning, this desire, this want to be able to learn that little bit more. Another thing that the Army's BAME network has done and continues to do is, as well as providing mentorship in a sort of hierarchical fashion to those nominally subordinates in our rank system, but also providing reverse mentorship to our senior leaders. And it has been really quite humbling to see a private soldier or a junior officer who's sitting down and having a good, candid conversation with a general who they're first to admit that they can't really understand certain aspects of an individual's journey or experience because they just don't have any frame of reference. And a desire to genuinely get under the skin of this and understand that is a really positive manifestation of some of the progress that has been made and we continue to make.
I absolutely agree, because it is, and I'm such a fan of reverse mentoring. I think it is absolutely excellent, absolutely excellent. And it helps to break down those, those archetypal hierarchies that formatively and still do exist within many businesses and organizations, but really seeing the world through the lens of someone else ultimately, which I think not that people intend necessarily to be uninclusive. I don't think people set out to necessarily be uninclusive. We must believe that people come from a good place, but just genuinely have a difficulty in looking through that lens because they just have not had that lived experience. Nav.
If I may just highlight a couple of small examples with the current situation in mind. It's Ramadan this month. Of course, as a Muslim, I'm fasting. If I wasn't in lockdown, I'd be carrying on with my normal work on a day-to-day basis. But I just wanted to share a couple of examples of the mindset of the organization. So next week, for example, we're because of the circumstances we find ourselves in, the Armed Forces Muslim Association in partnership with a couple of civilian organizations is going to deliver a virtual iftar. And the iftar is a meal that's taken at the end of the day of fasting. Because of the time of the year, it's around about 8:30, thereabouts, 8:45. And we've got the champion of the Armed Forces Muslim Association taking part. Potentially, we may have a senior politician taking part as well. And this is all that's happened in the very recent past, and I would say in the last 4 to 5 years, where senior people are feeling absolutely comfortable in engaging with members of the public, with most junior soldiers. Now, when I joined, and I dare say when my two colleagues joined, if you were a junior soldier and you were engaging with a senior officer, well, that was probably at your middle management level, and that was about the limit of the experience that you'd have of dealing with a senior officer. And then you have your own line manager who decides to join you on a day of fasting. Referring to Colonel Tim there, and who I was quite surprised. It was the first time he'd done it, considering his sort of background as a young person growing up in Pakistan, and as someone who's really got his finger on the pulse in terms of diversity and inclusivity. But it's really interesting hearing his feedback on WhatsApp throughout the day of how the day was panning out. And the one thing that the one comment that he made, which absolutely made me realize how in tune he was with me as a person and with my faith background, was when he said, you can't eat, you can't drink, but regardless of all of that, how the day absolutely focuses your mind. So it wasn't the fact that he was a bit hungry, a bit cranky maybe, yes, absolutely, a bit thirsty maybe, but he commented on the fact that the day made him focus, and for me that was someone who'd taken an interest in Muslim serving, potentially because he could relate to the service aspect, but then to go that one step further and think about the other identity of the multiple identities that we all have. Colonel, over to you.
That is, sorry, Tim, I hate to interrupt, but I can't help myself on this occasion. But that is just, now, that is an absolutely, that is just such a wonderful, wonderful example, if I may say so. And I have to say, I also, I would not expect anything less from Tim. You know, he's just a great guy. And then my husband, as a side note, absolutely loves Tim, loves talking about, you know, geopolitics and all this kind of stuff, but he's you know, just an absolutely just brilliant guy. And I think, and I would encourage other business leaders and people in general to take active interests in other people that maybe have come from different backgrounds, because the amount that you can learn and the things that you know, you feel in your heart from doing things like this, I think it's just absolutely fantastic. And I think, you know, especially when we come to kind of diversity and inclusion, we're talking about D&I, and I think there is certain stereotypes still that D&I just means purely, you know, black, white, female, male, etc., etc. It goes so much deeper than that. I think there are you know, almost concerns and worries from people that they will be vilified for saying or doing the wrong thing because they don't have the knowledge about that specific culture, whether it be iftar or whether it be, I don't know, talking about race specifically, sometimes quite an uncomfortable topic for some. But what you all said there was actually, you know, seniors getting involved, opening up these conversations. And that is actually the heart of, you know, solving these issues almost. It's actually talking about it, not being scared to be wrong. Because if that comes from a place that you said there, Nav, a place of goodness and a place of genuine interest, no one is going to be vilified for saying or doing the wrong thing. The interest and the genuine want and hunger and desire to learn from someone we care about is there. And that is all that matters. Sorry, Tim, I know I completely cut you off then, but I just couldn't help but say something. I thought it was a great example, so thank you for sharing.
Was thank you very much for the kind words to both of you. I feel slightly embarrassed now. So your question was around what I've learned. I think what Colonel Carl said about it all being about people is the key tenet of what I've based my answer. And I think what I've really learned is that everybody's equal, but everybody's different. And so as a leader, you need to be able to harness those differences, but treat people in the right way and be interested in and curious about them. And I'll pick that up in a moment. This is going to sound like a cliche, but it's true. You can learn something from everyone that you work with. You just have to listen to what they're actually telling you, and sometimes you have to listen to what they're saying, not necessarily the manner in which they say it. I think I've learned in this job an awful lot of what it's like not to be a white middle class man, and that has been incredibly enriching and at times uncomfortable. And I would urge everybody to have those difficult and uncomfortable conversations and read books that make you feel uncomfortable, because that's the only way we have to be comfortable with complexity when we're dealing with inclusion and diversity, because it's a complex and nuanced thing, and we're going to get it right sometimes, we're going to get it wrong sometimes, but generally there are people around you, and the army networks that Carl represents and that Nav represents are key in that work in helping people understand. And I think sort of the final bit, I would say that it's really important that those of us with privilege, whatever that might be, to extend the hand to those who necessarily don't currently have that privilege, and help them up, not in a condescending way, but in a way of equality and equal, and because it's the right thing to do. And I sort of finished my answer saying the army has a value, which is respect for others, and I think we owe it to ourselves to live that value, both because it's morally important, and that's the thing that's going to help us get organisations that win, because we are harnessing the best of our people.
I couldn't have said it better myself. That is just a brilliant way to kind of come to a close with this very special podcast. One thing I must say though is I did see you chuckling there when Nav was talking about you fasting. Thank you all ever so much. You've been absolutely fantastic today, and a real joy to have on the show. I feel very lucky and privileged to have been able to speak with you all on such a special day.
Thank you so much, Leila.
Thank you, Leila.
Thank you so much. By way of a very, very brief summary, which I usually do, and actually before we go into that, I think just wanted to say a very big thank you also, which Tim, I'm going to hand over to you, about General Harvey, because I know we've been very, very lucky to also hear from the General on this very special day. But Tim, I'm going to hand to you very, very briefly, and I'm going to give my sincere thanks before I go into a summary, post a brief piece from you, Tim.
Yeah, so General Celia Harvey, who's the Deputy Commander Field Army, and as such is the senior reserve officer in the British Army, has done a piece to video we've talked about today, about the Army's response to COVID-19, about inclusion and diversity, and about VE-Day. And additionally, General Celia is also the British Army Sikh champion. And so I know this subject of inclusion and diversity is very close to her heart, and the things that we talked about in terms of historical inclusion are also important from a general perspective, but with her hat on as the Sikh champion. So I hope you all enjoy the video that she's put together.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim, and thank you very, very much as well to Celia for very kindly giving some really wonderful advice and words of wisdom to everyone, which we will be putting out later on today. We've got a lot of content out today, actually, in celebration and recognition of this very, very special 75th anniversary. And finally, just to summarize what has been a truly fantastic special edition today, and again, there's been many learning points, so this is just a couple of key pieces from me. I think, in words of Carl, actually, if I revert back to the beginning of our discussion today, this really truly is a time to reflect. We really need to remember and honor the sacrifices that have been made before us and are still being made in this present world with the invisible enemy. I think it's very easy to forget what we have, and certainly, as you've all said, we must be vigilant and really protect what we hold dear. And on a personal note, I think Britain is a rich smorgasbord of different cultures, ethnicities, races, religions, beliefs, and this goes far, far, far beyond just the UK. And so whilst we're living in this crisis with the invisible enemy, let's harness the power of everyone across the world. It's times like this where you realize actually that globalization and the power of digital technology can actually bring us somewhat closer together. So let's utilize that where we can in our businesses, our organizations, and our communities to really empower people, to really share that knowledge, to share that wisdom, to share those inspiring stories that put a smile on our faces, and that we can share with our families, our children, and of course, wider society, because this is a time where we should be proud of the contributions that everyone is making, from our NHS and the key workers through to those that are serving our country in the military, and we must not forget. And a final point, just on role models, and in fact real models that we have in our society right now. I think we must recognise the importance of the eclectic mix of individuals. There's some brilliant people that you've all mentioned today that I'm so pleased that you have done, that we are all in this together, and to have that togetherness and to have that inclusivity is absolutely most important of all. Tim, you left on a final great comment there, having that respect for others, and Nav, you shared some great stories that were real kind of testament to that respect and that recognition. And so having that moral backbone is critical, and if we can harness that, then we are ultimately more powerful together. My name is Leila Mackenzie-Dellis, and you have been listening to a very special edition of the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast, the 75th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day. We've had 3 absolutely phenomenal guests on the show, and I hope you've enjoyed very much listening to their stories of inspiration, how they came to be where they are today. And why the army is so, so important to our great nation. Thank you very much for listening. And if you'd like to check out any further information, if you'd like to ask any questions to the guys, please do feel free to reach out to us. You can visit us at www.dahlglobal.org. This podcast will be on the COVID-19 Support Hub, and we'll also make sure that all of the details for the Army, the reservists, and the wider MOD are in the show notes at the end of today's show. So don't worry if you didn't manage to catch everything. All of the information will be there for you to listen to on demand and to share with anyone that you think will benefit from the show today.